Hello and thanks for joining us on Politics Now right here on LN 24/7. My name is Mono Balagbogo. We've got quite a packed show for you today. There's a lot happening in the nation and of course around Africa. But we will start with the Rivers political impasse. Here is a rundown of our talking points. Much ado about resource control as driving force of conflict. Fubara's strategic moves, relocates assembly, restrains pro-Wike legislators. Wike speaks, supporting Fubara a mistake. Cases pending in court, concerned citizens call for speedy judgments. Joining us on the show today is Samson Dumizo, political analyst. He's a writer and also a policy analyst. Then to our second conversation today, we will talk about West African juntas hold on power. Here is a rundown of our talking points. First, we'll look at the National Dialogue recommendation of extending military rule in Mali. Also, skepticism over Chad's transition to democratic governance and why transition to civilian governance has failed in junta-led nations. Joining us is David Otto. He is an international security expert. He's an independent global counter-terrorism PVE/CVE consultant and a specialized expert on geopolitical dynamics between the West, Middle East, and Africa. We'll be right back to break it all down. So let's begin with the presidency's comments on Rivers politics, where Anjuri Ngalale said President Bola Tinubu will not take sides with either the minister of the Federal Capital Territory, Nyesom Wike, or Governor Siminalayi Fubara over the ongoing political crisis rocking the state. Ngalale said that anyone with the belief that President Tinubu will take their side in the political crisis will be disappointed. According to him, President Tinubu won't allow any attempt to frustrate the Rivers government. Now, more facts are emerging with Edison Ehi, who is the chief of staff to Governor Siminalayi Fubara, giving more insight on the reason behind the frosty relationship between his principal and the former governor Nyesom Wike. He said the problem in Rivers State began when a few political leaders sought exclusive control of the resources of the state, and he warned that the governor is capable of teaching his opponents a political lesson. Okay, so it was indeed a weekend of trading words. Let's start with Governor Siminalayi Fubara, who ordered the immediate temporary relocation of the sitting of the State House of Assembly to the auditorium admin block of the Government House in Port Harcourt. Also, the Rivers State High Court in Port Harcourt granted an interim injunction restraining pro-Wike Speaker of the State House of Assembly, Martin Emewule, and 24 other members from parading themselves as legislators. You would recall that the Martin Emewule-led group of the Rivers State House of Assembly raised alarm over an alleged plot by Governor Siminalayi Fubara to demolish the Assembly quarters on Oba Road in Port Harcourt, the state capital. Talk about political drama. Now, let's come to the side of Governor Wike, who was speaking at a function in Ogubolo local government area of Rivers State on Saturday, apologizing to the people of the state for his, in quote, mistake. He said he is a human who is bound to mistake, assuring the people, however, that the mistake will be corrected at the appropriate time. Now, with all of this back and forth between Fubara and Tim Wike, some residents of Port Harcourt are calling on the judiciary to expedite judgments on cases linked to the political turmoil in the state. And of course, the focus majorly from the courts that we are waiting for their judgment has to do with the legitimacy of the 25 State House of Assembly legislators who recently switched from the All Progressive Congress APC to the PDP. Well, joining us on the show tonight to make sense of all these developments is Samson Dumizo, political analyst. Thank you so much for being with us.
Always a privilege, sir.
also us here having you on board. So let's get straight to it. Let's start with a reaction from the presidency on what is going on in the state, saying that President Bola Tinubu will not take a side. What's your take on these comments?
Um, as enlightened citizens, I think that we should only expect that Mr. President, being the father of this good nation, father to all political parties, all Nigerians, should be able to exude justice and fairness in dealing with political issues in the country. In this particular case, River State. And Mr. President, through his spokesman, has said yes, he wouldn't take sides on this matter. And that's what we expect him to do. If we are, anticipating Nigeria to be a sinner climb, then all of us would have to adjust our perspective from the old way of playing politics to expect that people will begin to utilize power fairly in this country. And I do not think I'm expecting Mr. President to take sides, even though he is the leader of the All Progressives Congress by virtue of being the president of this country today and one who enjoys the platform, the presidential ticket of the All Progressives Congress. But we must understand that the issues are not just about PDP and APC. It is about River State. And River State falls under the jurisdiction of the president and the president of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. So Mr. President's responsibility would be, to settle the disputes in the states. And that accounts for why, he had intervened owing to the calls of several Nigerians and Rivers citizens for him to step into the problem in River State. And then, of course, that necessitated the peace pact that was signed in Aso Rock in front of the press. Whether that had been followed so far judiciously or not, that is something to look into. But I expect that Mr. President will continue to be a father. I don't expect him to foil the crisis. I expect him to call for peace, which he has exemplified by the agreement with the truce he called for. So I agree with the spokesman to the president. And I do not think that any.
Okay, now let's talk about the reason why we are here at this point, having Fubara and Wike's team going at each other. You need to recall that the chief of staff to the governor, Edison Ehi, who was formerly, a member of the House of Assembly, has come out to say that control of state resources is the sole reason why we are in this mess, talking about, of course, themselves, those who are key stakeholders in the conversation of Rivers politics. What is your reaction to his assertion to why this crisis is even existing in the first place?
And it's difficult to separate power from money, when we talk about politics, especially in Nigeria. But then, I wouldn't want to blow things out of proportion. Edison Ehi is the chief of staff to the government of River State, and governor rather of River State. And if that's his opinion about what's happening, that's his own opinion. But then we must look at the principal actors and what they have said so far. I haven't heard the governor of River State tell River State that the problem he's having with his political father in quotes is about controlling the resources of the state. I would wait to hear the governor say that. Secondly, I have not also heard from the minister, who is the political father to the governor of River State, Sin Fubara, also talk about money being the problem while they're having issues. Rather, what I have heard the minister say is that he will not sit back and watch the governor destroy his structure, his political structure. And my understanding of structure in politics is about having organs of the party and government that have been set in place, revolving around your own political family. So I haven't heard otherwise other than structure, and the issues have now moved from those personal issues of talking about political structure into institutional battles in the states, where you now have the executive and the legislature at each other's neck, and now, of course, the judiciary would have to be drawn in. So that's what I know for now. if the chief of staff to the governor, uh, whom of course we believe is a proxy of the governor, is saying that it's about control of the resources, and then there's a lot of questions to ask. Uh, the only signatory, perhaps to the control of the resources of the state as known to the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria when it comes to the state is the governor. And perhaps the Accountant General of the state and maybe Attorney General and Commissioner for Finance. So I do not see where the comes in here. It's neither the governor, it's neither the Attorney General, neither the Accountant General, neither the Commissioner for Finance. So if it does not have the authorized signature to control the resources of the state, I wonder why that should be a problem.
Okay, talking about that being a problem, I can understand your point of view, but let's not dismiss the thought that when you talk about a political structure, money flows within that structure. So for you to excuse Fubara and his camp, of that not really being a logical reason why this crisis existing is in the first place, is can be concerning for some people who may feel that when you look at the purpose of godfatherism in the Nigerian context, I mean, some would argue that it is to keep, the flow of not just your processes, but possibly income. Well, allegedly, I'm not saying this is the reality in Rivers political crisis situation, but what's your take on this line of thought, rather?
Well, I understand your point, and we must also agree that when there are political disputes of this nature, you're going to have fly stories, what we call political propaganda. People would put out narratives there in the public to give them some sort of advantage. But then, as we always say, he who alleges, has the onus to prove. So, if the chief of staff to the governor now alleges in public that what's causing the feud is about resource control, controlling the resources of River State. And then they would have to prove, they would have to come to the public, to prove and provide documents and evidences, to their claims. But until then, for a more rational being in my class, I think we would want to just categorize that as, a mere public opinion. And of course, you could just call it a propaganda because the statement didn't come with proof. So they are alleging, they have the responsibility to prove to the public that what is causing the problem in River State is about resource control. Until that is proven, I personally would not fall into the net or the trap of such schemes in the public space because I like to deal with facts. So if the chief of staff feels that that's the problem, then he should be able to come to the public to tell us. After all, they are the ones holding and controlling the resources of the state. So they owe us every detail about the use and control of our resources. So that's what I believe should be foregoing. It's not enough to dish out allegations in the public space. Half truth will not resolve the problem. If you want the support of Rivers people, you should be able to tell us the entirety of what's happening. And like I always say, nobody has told us any other thing different from what's really in the public. That there's a misunderstanding between the Rivers State House of Assembly and the executive, and there's a misunderstanding obviously between the former governor and the current governor. What is foundational to that problem is what they need to prove and not just allege in public space. That's their responsibility to prove.
Okay, so let's talk about Fubara, because I would have loved to push in further with your line of thought, but because of time, we have other talking points to actually thrash out on the show. Now, Fubara ordered the immediate temporary relocation of the seating of the State House of Assembly. In that clip, you saw him, moving around the assembly, sort of monitoring the construction work going there. And of course, it will move to the admin block of the government house in Port Harcourt, and also his decision via the State High Court to grant interim injunction restraining pro-Wike Speaker of the State House of Assembly, Martin Emewili, and the other lawmakers, who defected from the PDP to the APC. Now, is this move strategic, or it is just one that he will regret?
I think the governor needs to be a little bit careful as much as he's trying to be politically strategic. First, I do not see why the governor would burst into the assembly quarters for no reason other than he came to inspect the building and to see how befitting it is for the wind of the assembly that is loyal to him. Talking about the three members of the assembly that are loyal to him, as against the 27 on the other end. There is a judgment that I know of, from the Federal High Court, which also almost takes the same position as that which is from the lower courts here in River State. And when these two sister courts make a judgment or give an injunction, rather, the first priority goes to the first court, that gave an injunction on the same matter. And if the governor did not implement what the Federal High Court, as given by Justice Omotosho, if he didn't implement the terms in that injunction, why is he suddenly ready to implement the terms that are in this other injunction? And mind you, the injunction came after the assembly had so declared themselves as the legitimate assembly without anything in law, or giving that mandate. All of these controversies, like I always say, is not going to help reverse it, because at the end of the day, we're going to be dancing around the corridors of the courts, and governance in the states will continue to suffer because this is a distraction. The governor will be channeling resources and energy and time into a political battle. And he will also be, as much as he antagonizes, he will also have to play the defensive in the political war, and all of this becomes a distraction. It's going to be one day in office in the next few days, and we're supposed to be looking at several projects that have been done across the 23 LGAs of this state. River State government cannot complain that they've not had resources. In fact, the governor had claimed that the IGRO of the state had moved, to about 27 billion, from 10 billion since he came in. So the only justification for that influx and rising figure is the projects that are done with the money. And in the next few days, Rivers people will be looking at seeing what this government has been able to do with the plethora or the staggering resources that have come to us in the state. If the chief of staff has said this problem is about control of resources, and the control of the resources have been within the liberty of the governor solely, then we should also be ready in the few days coming to show us projects that this government has done to justify the billions of naira that have come into the state. So I do not fancy all of these issues as much as the court has a responsibility to look at the controversy and make a pronouncement. But keeping governance at the corridor of the judiciary, is not the best at all. I feel that some of these issues could have been resolved through some kind of dialogue, and peace measures.
All right, most definitely, I agree with your line of thought. It is definitely affecting governance. Well, let's talk about Wike's comments on Saturday, referring to Fubara as a mistake that he will correct. Fubara started this trading of tough words in the first place. Recall the last time on Wednesday when we talked about Rivers politics and we played the video, where he was talking to some of the lawmakers saying he paid some of their school fees and all of that. So that's some, big words to use there. And Wike is calling Fubara, a mistake. What do you make of his comments?
Well, the entire world is aware how Fubara became governor of Rivers State. Governor Fubara became the governor of Rivers State. Everybody understands and appreciates the fact that it was the minister who solely picked, receiving a political son at the time, to make the governor of the state. Everybody knows how the primaries went. Everybody knows how the elections went and how Fubara had become governor of Rivers State. So we cannot take it from the minister that he made Fubara the governor of Rivers State. So if he who made the governor now says, look, I made a mistake, then we must give it to him because Fubara being the governor today was his craft, all right, was his political craft. And the man who molds the pot, the potter, who takes the clay and molds the pot, now says, look, I didn't mold this properly. I made a mistake. Then we should give it to him because he is the expert in this case who made the pot. So if the minister has said, look, I made a mistake, then we should give it to him that he made a mistake, because it was by his instance that the governor emerged as the governor of Rivers State. And when he says this will be corrected at the appropriate time, well, I do not know when the appropriate time is. I can't foretell when the appropriate time is. But the only thing I can say is that should this linger into the next electioneering season, which is 2027, and then that will be an opportunity for the minister to maybe partner with some other persons or find some other person, to support to be the governor of the state. But away from that, it will just be that between now and then, if things go the way of the minister, then something could just happen within the life of this administration, and that could possibly be bygone to the governor. But of course, you hear the governor say, for now, he repeatedly says it that for now, I am here, for now, I am here. That means he also anticipates somewhere in his mind that at some point something could just happen and he will no longer be the governor of Rivers State. So whatever we are doing should be in the interest of Rivers State. If we're correcting a mistake that has been made, it should be in the interest of Rivers State. If we feel it's not a mistake, it should be in the interest of Rivers State. The common factor here should be about how this benefits the people of Rivers State and Nigeria at large.
I agree with you, Samson. The people is key in terms of how governance affects them. When you look at some of the residents of Port Harcourt over the weekend, especially the youth speaking out on the crisis, calling upon the judiciary to expedite judgments quickly so that the cases can be resolved and then we can know the fate of the lawmakers who defected, whether they're going to be members of the House or not. So this is not happening anytime soon from what we are seeing. What is the hope of the common man in Rivers State regarding this issue? If it is delaying governance, I could recall in one of the national dailies, I was reading some of the thoughts of the persons that they interviewed, and he said, this crisis has affected my business.
The hope for the common man at the end of the day is that government functions, within the bandwidth of this time and functions effectively, fulfilling its mandate and making life easy for citizens. I believe that governance is running, even though at a distracted state. But if the governor still has access to resources, then nothing stops him from providing the dividends of democracy to Rivers people. And that's where the hope of the common man lies, that they have an environment that they can do their businesses, they have an environment where they can school, they have a good health system, they have empowerment from government, and they have constant or stable power supply, and all of those are basic or social amenities expected of the government to provide. So the hope of the common man ultimately is that this government in Rivers State functions efficiently, effectively, and in the most appropriate manner. So that's the hope of the common man. But when you think about dispensing justice by the judiciary, there's a split between Rivers people right now. There are those who support Sim Kubara, there are those who support the minister. So what those who support Sim calls justice may not be what those who support the minister calls justice. But however, everybody beckons that because these issues are now on the tables of our judges or within the doors and corridors of the judiciary, they expect that because of the seeming distractions in the state and the tension in the political space, justice will be dispensed quickly so that all issues of doubt and controversy will be resolved, and then whoever wins has the day, and then we move on as a people. So that's where the judiciary comes in, and we must understand that these issues are have roots. There are different branches to it. There are plethora of cases in the court and in different courts. So the political class of the gladiators have made it difficult for the judiciary to also quite easily dispense justice, because there are court injunctions flying here and there, to compound the issues. But then I am aware that the first instance in this case had journeyed to the appeal court, and after the appeal court, of course, it will get to the apex court, which is the Supreme Court, and that will be the finality of the controversies. And whatever the court pronounces on the controversy around the assembly members, eventually will give a breath of fresh air to the circumstance, even though it will not end the political crisis, because each side, as I observe, tends to fight to finish. So at the end of the day, a side will have to ultimately be dislodged. That's what I observed. But then the court making a pronouncement, a very crucial pronouncement on the status of the assembly members, would go a long way to give also a breath of fresh air in the state, even though it may not solve the problem immediately. But of course, that would be a mileage in the crisis.
Okay, Samson. Let's move forward a bit and focus on the issue of the decision, rather, of the governor to move the House of Assembly to the government house. Now, there's been so many reactions. Legal luminary Falana say, under the constitution of the law, that is not possible. So, are we going to see the defected lawmakers barge into the government house? How does this compound things when we talk about this political crisis in Rivers?
What I can say is that the crisis is climaxing, for the governor to have taken that step. But I do not expect the 27 members to go to the government house to sit. That would be them submitting to the leadership of the house that they do not recognize, evidently so in the issues before the courts. So I do not expect them to go to government house and want to stick to submit to that leadership. 27 cannot submit to 3. If we say that the 27 do not exist, it will be absurd to expect that those 27s in quote who do not exist would go to submit to the 3 assembly members. 3 cannot be greater than 27, in common arithmetic. So I do not expect them to. What I say is that the 27 members will continue if their access to their facilities is unhindered. They will continue to sit and then of course continue to function. And in doing so, they will have the right to continue to sit. Because the situation has been thrown into a bigger confusion with diverse court injunctions, which will be difficult to justify, which to obey and which not to obey.
Now, talking about the defected lawmakers, I'm just trying to imagine in my head right now, what is the tangibility of whatever decision they make in any of the sessions that they have, or plenary? I think that's the right word to use, because the governor is not going to assent to whatever they decide on. So why waste your time trying to have like a different house? The GovPro Fubara lawmaker supporters have their own speaker. Those who are for Wiki have their own speaker. Does it really make any sense?
No, the tangibility of their sitting is owing to the vitality of the law. If until the court says these persons finally are not members of the State House of Assembly, the circumstance so far permits them or allows them to go about their duties. So until the court says you are not a member of the assembly, then their mandate ceases to exist. But for now, they are still functioning within the ambit of the judgments that have been given or the injunctions that have been given in their favor. So, and that's where we are at the moment. The governor, yes, may not assent to whatever is passed by the current 27 members of the assembly, but then it does not invalidate them. The governor, if he chooses to recognize 3 against 27, well, that's within the liberty of what he knows and have chosen to operate by. But at the end of the day, if the decisions taken by this government finally comes to an annulment by the court validating the 27 members, then the governor would have, defaulted and taken a constitutional mishap, which is consequential. But at this point, I pray that the courts speedily deals with this matter so that we can have a headway in the state and know what we're doing. I also see that even if, from the disposition of the government, the court validates the 27 members, they're still going to be in the pool of not consenting to what the assembly entirely would send to the government. But that will further even deepen the political crisis and put the people at disadvantage. I feel that strategically what the governor is trying to do by recognizing the 3 assembly members is to create a constitutional atmosphere where he can send appointees to these 3 members, and it will be seen as though the assembly has given legal consent to the actions of the governor. And I feel that's what the governor is trying to do, to use the 3 persons in the assembly, whom he now recognizes as the assembly, to validate the actions and legitimize decisions of government. Which, for instance, is maybe appointment of commissioners and members of sensitive and parastatals and agencies of the River State government. That's what I perceive. And he wants to do that quickly so that the actions and decisions of government under his watch does not continue to suffer. You would recall that the former Attorney General had resigned, Professor Zacchaeus had resigned, and he leaves that office of the Commissioner of Justice and Attorney General of the state vacant. And I feel that the governor wants to have it.
Okay, our time is almost spent, Samson Dumiso. Thank you so much for joining us. And I pray that everything regarding Rivers politics is settled and there is peace for the sake of governance in the state. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much. It's always a privilege. Thank you so much.
Definitely. We do hope we can have you back on the show. Well, we've got to move on to talk about some other thing, but that will be right after the break. Stay with us. Glad to know you're still watching Politics Now on LN 24/7. If you just tuned in, we just finished talking about Rivers politics, but this time we want to focus on the West African Juntas' hold on power. Let's remind you of some of our talking points again. National Dialogue recommendation of extending military rule in Mali. We'll also talk about the skepticism over Chad's transition to democratic governance. And finally, if we have enough time, we'll talk about why transition to civilian governance has failed in junta-led nations. And we've got the right person to talk with us, David Otto, international security expert. And of course, we'll just do a breakdown of what's going on around the continent as relating to some of the political juntas. Now, let's have a look at 6 African countries currently being ruled by military junta. We've got some graphics so we can establish, okay, who is affected in terms of holding on to power. So number 1 on our list is Gabon. The military in Gabon on August 30th, 2023, staged a coup and ousted the country's president, Ali Bongo Ondimba. And at number 5, Niger, the country's government was overthrown by General Abdurrahman Tiani and was proclaimed as the head of state on August 20th, 2023. And number 4, Burkina Faso, the most recent military-led coup took place in in that country January 2022. And the country has had a history of military intervention. At number 3, Sudan. On October 25th, 2021, the Sudanese military seized full control of the country and dismissed a civilian government led by Abdallah Hamdok. And number 2, Guinea. Educationist Alpha Condé was deposed in 2021 by Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya, who is now the 7th interim president of Guinea. Then we'll come to the country that we'll start our conversation on, which has to do with Mali. Colonel Assimi Goïta, who is currently the president of the interim government of Mali, he seized power from the government of President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta in 2020. So let's discuss. Now, a recent national dialogue in Mali concluded with recommendations supporting the extension of military rule for several more years. Participants, mainly from the military, proposed that Colonel Assimi Goïta, the leader of the junta that seized power back in 2020, should be allowed to run for the presidency in future elections. However, the dialogue was marked by significant opposition boycotts, with critics accusing the military of using the process to prolong its hold on power. Mali has experienced successive coups in 2020 and 2021, leading to military rule. Initially, promises were made to transition to civilian governance through democratic elections, but these plans have been indefinitely postponed due to security concerns stemming from jihadist attacks in April. The military authorities further tightened their grip by suspending all political activities and clamping down on opposition figures, journalists, and human rights activists. Well, joining us now on the show is David Otto, international security expert. Thank you so much for taking our time to talk with us, David. It's been a while.
Thank you very much for having me on your program.
Okay, so let's get to it. Let's start with your reaction to the development of what's going on in Mali. I know this is not surprising for you because we've been talking about, the Sahelian politics relating to security for quite some time now.
I think my reaction is very clear in terms of what has been happening in Mali and the Sahel. The military junta took power in 2020 under the premises that the previous administration, which was a democratic system of governance, had ineffectively dealt with the insecurity in the northern part of Mali. And the junta justified that by saying that the insecurity was impacting on the social and economic fabrics. So they clearly linked the insecurity to the lack of development, high level of unemployment, poverty rates, and all that. So they took power by force unconstitutionally and promised that they will then hand over power to a transitional government, something that did not happen or has not happened as we speak. In terms of how the Malian military has been, or the military junta has been dealing with the insecurity since 2020, there is still much left to be desired. Of course, attacks are still ongoing by groups that are linked to Al-Qaeda. The economy has still not stabilized. The Malian junta has argued that it needs time, and hence, it then forged alliances with, Burkina Faso and Mali. They established the Liptako-Goma Alliance, the Alliance of Sahelian States. They're also planning on actually establishing a confederation. And if you look at the details of these structures, it's not just about a military pact or a military alliance, it's also about economic development. Remember that these nations, have been, were initially suspended by ECOWAS and then the African Union. So they faced a further. We don't know if they're going to do that. So this dialogue, that accord, whereby the Malian authorities have now come to a conclusion albeit the opposition that is being faced, they've come to a conclusion. One, the military junta is going to continue perhaps until 2027. And another element of the dialogue which they had was the fact that, Colonel Assimi Goita, who is the transitional copycat of what has happened in the case of Chad, where General Mahatma of the son of Idris Deby, removed his military regalias and, maintained his title as a general and then ran for president and won just recently. So this was highly predictable. And I don't think, anything that we've seen in the case of Mali should be a surprise to anyone.
Now, David, many are questioning, even I myself, the makeup of the National Dialogue group of persons, as you saw in that clip. Now, it's mostly people from the military. Majority of them are from the military. And some will say that this is not all-inclusive, because how do you transition to democratic governance if the people who make up, democracy, democracy is defined as, the governance by the people and for the people. So how do you make all of these, how do you explain what's going on in Mali? Because some will find this laughable.
Yes, I'm sure that I got you clearly in terms of your question, but there's a breakup in terms of the network there, but I'm sure I got you right. The makeup, it's primarily members of the military and those that are quite in favor of maintaining a military style of governance. But of course, the national dialogue, is meant to be a national dialogue, and that means it is inclusive of all fabrics and all socioeconomic establishments or institutions. They've argued on their side that it was an inclusive dialogue. But on the other hand, the opposition that were quoted, the dialogue have argued that it was just a rubber stamp for the military junta to continue to stay in power. So it's one voice against the other, and it does appear that the Malian authorities, and I'm talking about the military junta, does have gathering some popular support owing to its very strong rhetoric against Western interference, and I'm talking about the likes of France, the anti-French, colonial rhetorics, So whatever is being driven in terms of narrative has been that anyone who is opposing the military junta is pro-Western or pro-France, and they've used that very well to leverage on their position. Now, the question is, what is it that the opposition can do to stop the outcome of the national dialogue? I think very little will happen in that sense. So more or less, we're seeing military junta moving from a military governance to a democratic process, to which there will be a main stakeholder. So I'm afraid that the opposition's voice, it's going to be silenced.
Now, as a security expert, his security challenges, are saluted by the junta. Is it a good enough reason to continue to hold on to power?
Well, I think generally what we see is that, when it comes to beneficiaries of coup d'etat, especially in the case of Mali, one must not forget that, there is a high level of interest from the stakeholders who benefit from power. Yes, of course, there will be justifications, like I mentioned earlier on, whereby the military junta would always cite the weaknesses of the democratic system, as a reason for them to take power. In terms of, how, that relates to the people, and I'm talking about the people of Mali, it all depends on the rhetoric that the military decides to put out there. At this point in time, the military is arguing that national security supersedes anything else. And therefore, if the country is not secure, no matter what you do, you will have a bad economy, you have a destabilized social fabric, you have an unstable political system, and that's not a lie. We've seen that in many other countries that, as soon as you have insecurity, for example, in the case of Nigeria, you will have scenarios where there will be a very strong impact on the social and economic fabric. So I think the question is always, what has the military juntas done in the case of Mali to stabilize the insecurity situation? I mean, they would argue that they've brought in the likes of Russia to, leverage the position that used to be occupied by the likes of MINUSMA, Operation Barkhane of France, before that, Operation Seval. So they would say that, they've also established a defense pact, some kind of an Article 5, which, prevents gives neighboring states like Burkina Faso and Niger. I mean, just recently, the Malian authorities claimed to have, been responsible for the assassination of one of the most powerful jihadist leaders in the Sahel. They kind of, liken him to Osama bin Laden of Al-Qaeda, when it comes to the Sahel. So they are showing that they are doing something. But the question is, where does that leave civilians? Is it a long-term project? Do civilians see this as, okay, let's be patient, until when, things stabilize? Or do civilians see this as a betrayal or a matter of, complete self-interest by men in uniform and men with guns, to overthrow a system of democracy, which, of course, they argue that it has never worked well for them?
Now, I still don't get why juntas feel that democracy won't work when even in the democracy regime or governance, the military is still in charge of the national security, because I still trying to make it make sense. Maybe you can help me make it make sense, rather.
I think the argument has always been that, the deficiencies of a democratic system, specifically in the case of Africa, and, particularly when you talk about the Sahel, is that most of the governments that have been in place under the banner of democracy have often, used the military to keep them in power. And, you have a system of governance where there is no independence of the judiciary, legislature, and the executive, which means the democratic system, the structure, is not well established. You have a system where the courts interfere in the executive, or the executive interfere in the matters of the court, where the laws are meant for some and not for others, kind of selective legislature. So the weaknesses of democracy has often exposed democratic governance to military, because, of course, often the presidents or the leaders of government, will use the military to either execute certain orders which may be against the will of the people. Remember, democracy has the people's voice and the people's will at the heart of it. But in a system of governance where you claim you have democracy and you then oppress the people when they do, for example, protest against a certain, a government decision or policy, then you use the military. What has often happened since African independence is that the leaders who have come to power, have done very badly, and then they've used the military to, what you call regime protection, to protect their regimes. And that has exposed them to the military, who see this as, okay, if they are relying on us, then, why can't we just take power ourselves? And that's why countries, for example, like Nigeria, had so many military coup d'etats, because, they thought they were doing what, they were the custodian of democratic, structures. And if they were the custodian of democratic structures, and if those structures were not working properly as they should work, the men in guns will just fancy taking power themselves. And this is where we are when it comes to, countries like Mali. It is not that, these men are really competent enough. It is that they have been the watchmen of, these incompetent leaders, and therefore, at some point they think to themselves, why shouldn't I take power? Why should it be him if he's relying on me?
This matter is really complicated because in these countries, there's a lot of people support this military juntas. So the question is whether, they've seen the dividends of democracy across, African countries in general to want to, desire to move to a democratic form of governance. But let's move on with our talking point. Let's get to Chad. What do you make of the Chad situation in terms of the fact that they just finished an election? Deby has been reelected as the democratic president of the state. Now, I've watched verified videos from the AFP of citizens who have said that this is just a clear hold on power. What do you make of this? The fact that a military leader, is, of course, this is more of like after his dad was assassinated, there was no legitimate person who was responsible for leading the nation up till now, or up till the time he stepped in rather, and now moving to have him back as president under a democratic form of governance, it's questionable for some persons. What are your thoughts on what's happening? Do you think Chad rather is going to begin to reap the dividends of democracy, or there's just clearly not going to be any difference? I know time will tell us more, but what is your reaction?
I think what Chad has done is trying to right the wrongs of the initial decision. General Mahatma, took power unconstitutionally. Literally, that was a military coup. He was not the legitimate replacement of his father. So he took power and, promised to transition to democracy. And the expectation was that, he will not, put himself as a candidate for any eventual presidential election. But, there you go. Once you're in power, you can make decisions, as you wish. So, and again, this is why I did mention in the beginning that you use the men in guns, to make these decisions or to help you to, safeguard whatever decisions you made. So he has put himself up, transformed into a military general. Now he's, a democratic leader. He's won elections. Oppositions, have complained and declared themselves as winner. The prime minister, said he won the elections, and so again, it brings you to the same issues which I mentioned earlier on. While the world wants to see democracy as some kind of a general system of governance, leaders are finding their way around it. So instead of being a military general, which of course is going to raise eyebrows nationally and internationally, what he's done is simply put his military regalia aside and put on a civilian attire. But the dynamics of leadership still remains the same. He's still going to use the military to oppress people, or to make decisions, or to keep decisions that have been made, or to keep people under bay, or to subdue any protest. So it is going to be the same thing. But one has to see what happens. The French, for example, President Macron was one of the only European leaders who attended the inauguration of Idriss Déby Jr. And this was clearly a coup d'etat. But they were the same country that condemned the military coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. And at some point, we're pushing very much behind the scenes, for ECOWAS to carry out a decision to invade Niger, which almost set the region into chaos. So the question for Chad is, one, is there going to be any changes? The proof of the pudding has to be seen in the eating. We've got to wait and see if there will be any changes. But I think the bad precedent which we've had with Chad is that other countries in the Sahel, and we've seen that in Mali just recently, will copy.
Okay, finally, before I let you go, David, what is your thoughts on why these juntas, find it very difficult to fully transition to democratic governance? Now, this is beyond Chad, Mali. I want us to look holistically. We talked about Gabon, Sudan, Guinea-Bissau, Burkina Faso, and all of that. Just help us wrap up your thoughts quickly. I think I'll give you less than 2 minutes to do that.
Well, I think, first of all, a country like Niger Republic had proposed to ECOWAS that it required 3 years transition in order for them to hand over power to a transitional government, of course, and then, of course, that transitional government will organize for democratic elections. This is a very fine script. All countries that have had military takeovers have done the same. They say the same thing. But when the time comes for them to hand over power, they will then either postpone the transitional government, for a further year or two, or simply, get themselves, to run as leaders. So this is how it works. And on one hand, it tells you that they do recognize that, the only sustainable system of governance is democracy. And this is why they wish to transition to democracy or hand over power to a transitional government, because they know that the international community or the nationals do not have the appetite for a complete military regime, just like we had in several countries in the 1960s after the independence of most African states. People don't have that appetite. I mean, it's a time in the 21st century where freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of thought, the right to protest, all these very fundamental principles, that human beings do require.
Okay, our time is up. David, also thank you once again for being with us in Politics Now.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure to have you
for
with
having
us.
me.
All right, and that's our show for today. Thank you for watching. My name is Mono Balagogo. See you next time on Politics Now.